Have you ever heard of R D Lange? Well, if you're a fan of the psychology movement, you might have come across his work, or at least his name. But who was he? What did he do? And why is he considered one of the founders of anti-psychiatry? Edited by the renowned Dr. Stephen F. Myler, Ph.D. In this video, we'll take a look at the life and career of R D Lange, one of the most important but also controversial figures in the history of psychiatry. Alright, let's go back to the beginning. Rudolf Doos, or Ronnie Lange, was born on 27th of August, 1927 in Perth, Scotland, to parents who were both psychiatrists. From an early age, it seemed that Ronnie was going to follow in their footsteps. He excelled at school, and eventually won a scholarship to study medicine at the University of Edinburgh. However, after 2 years, he transferred to the University of London, where he switched his degree to psychiatry. It seems he was always interested in mental illness. At the age of 14, he wrote a story for school about a boy who develops schizophrenia and goes to hospital. He then wrote another story about a girl who is possessed by the devil. Although Lange never formally joined the church, he was clearly fascinated by religion and spirituality. And when he was 18, he spent a year working in a monastery in Switzerland. After graduating from university in 1950, Lange returned to Scotland to complete his psychiatric training. Here, he met and married his wife Sonia, who became a psychoanalyst. In 1963, Lange was appointed consultant psychiatrist at the Philadelphia Psychiatric Unit in London. This unit had been set up to try something new in the treatment of schizophrenia, namely, to treat them in a family setting rather than in isolation. The idea was that being alone and cut off from everything familiar was making the illness worse. So, instead, the family members would be brought into the hospital during the day to spend time with their relative. And then, on weekends, the whole family would go home as a unit. Lange loved this job because it gave him the opportunity to interact with people from different backgrounds and from different walks of life. He didn't like the traditional approach to medicine, which he saw as being too narrow and dogmatic. He was fond of telling stories about some of his patients, especially the ones that made the doctors laugh. One time, he was called to see a patient who had just jumped out of a window. As he was making his way to the scene, he heard some nurses gossiping. "He wasn't mad," they said. "He was only trying to get away from us." Lange realized that their fear was driving them to ignore what the patient was trying to tell them. So, once he was able to speak to the patient, he learned that he had jumped out of the window because he wanted to show everyone that he wasn't mad. Lange soon became friendly with the head of the Philadelphia department, Maxwell Jones. They shared a similar view of the world, and together they developed a therapeutic community in the style of the Philadelphia approach. In addition, they began holding weekly group meetings with the staff to discuss how they could improve the quality of care they were providing. These group meetings were very intense and laid the foundation for Lange's future work on group dynamics and interpersonal relationships. He was also spending more time with patients, talking to them about their lives and listening to their experiences. This was not unusual in itself. After all, this was a therapeutic community. But what was unusual was that Lange was actually listening to his patients. He didn't think that schizophrenia meant that someone was crazy or irrational. Instead, he believed that it was a way of coping with a difficult reality. He started to notice that the doctors and nurses often misunderstood what the patients were saying, and he began to realize that this was because they were approaching them in the wrong way. If the doctor thinks you're mad, you start to feel like you are mad. In 1965, Lange published an influential paper on schizophrenia which outlined his new ideas. He believed that the problem with schizophrenia was not that the patient was ill, but that the environment they were living in was not conducive to recovery. He argued that the illness was a way of coping with a difficult reality, and that by changing the environment, it was possible to help the patient make sense of their experiences. This paper was well received, and Lange began to develop a reputation as a leading thinker in the field of schizophrenia. However, Lange was not satisfied with the progress he was making at the Philadelphia clinic. He wanted to do more to help his patients. And so, in 1968, he co-founded the Kingsley Hall Foundation with several of his colleagues. The goal of this foundation was to create a new kind of psychiatric hospital that was based on the principles of anti-psychiatry. Anti-psychiatry was a movement that emerged in the 1960s, which argued against the medical model of mental illness. It saw mental illness as a natural response to a pathological society, and called for a more humane and compassionate approach to treatment. The movement was highly influential and led to significant changes in the way mental illness was understood and treated. Lange was one of the leading figures in the anti-psychiatry movement, and his work had a profound impact on its development. Lange ran the Kingsley Hall Clinic for 4 years, but it was never free of controversy. In 1972, Lange and one of his colleagues, John Gunn, began experimenting with LSD and other drugs with their patients. This was seen as highly unethical by many, and led to the withdrawal of funding from the clinic. Nevertheless, Lange continued to experiment with drugs, and in 1975 he wrote a book about his experiences called Knots Landing. The book was well received and helped to popularize the use of psychedelics in therapy. But this is when things really took a turn for the worst. His private life had always been chaotic. He had affairs, he drank heavily, and he was frequently depressed. And after the closure of the clinic, his behavior became even more erratic. He began to abuse alcohol, and he became increasingly isolated. His friends and colleagues were deeply concerned about him, and many tried to intervene, but it was too late. Lange was beyond help. He died on 23 August 1989 in a tragic accident. He was crossing the street when he was hit by a taxi and killed instantly. R D Lange was a brilliant and controversial figure whose work had a profound impact on the field of psychiatry. He challenged the prevailing views of his time, and his insights into mental illness continue to be relevant today. Love him or hate him, there's no denying that he was one of the most important psychiatrists of the 20th century. Now here's the thing. There are literally hundreds of hours of footage of interviews with Lange online, most of them freely available. I mean, the man was a genius, but that doesn't mean that he was always right. And there are some parts of his theories that are definitely questionable. For example, he believed that schizophrenia was not an illness but a way of coping with a difficult reality. While this may be true in some cases, it's not true in all cases. Schizophrenia is a complex disorder with multiple causes, and it's not always a response to environmental factors. Lange also believed that mental illness was largely a product of social and cultural factors, and that, by changing the social and cultural environment, it was possible to prevent mental illness. While there's some truth to this, it's not always possible to change the social and cultural environment, and even if it were possible, it wouldn't necessarily prevent mental illness. Despite these limitations, Lange's work was hugely influential, and he helped to change the way we understand and treat mental illness. He was one of the first psychiatrists to take a holistic approach to treatment, taking into account not only the patient's mental state, but also their social and cultural environment. He was also one of the first psychiatrists to experiment with new and unconventional treatments, such as LSD and other psychedelics. Lange's work was not without its critics. Many of his contemporaries saw him as being too radical, and his ideas were often seen as controversial. However, Lange was not afraid to speak his mind, and he continued to push the boundaries of psychiatric thought until his death. Okay, now, let's move on to my favorite part of the video. You know, the part where I tell you guys what books to read next. But before that, if you're enjoying this series on the history of psychology, be sure to check out the rest of the episodes. We've covered a lot of ground, from the early days of the psychology movement to the rise of behaviorism and everything in between. So there's bound to be something that interests you. But anyway, let's get back to Lange. If you want to learn more about his work, I recommend reading one of his most famous books, The Divided Self. It was published in 1960 and explores the nature of schizophrenia and the self. Lange believed that schizophrenia was a breakdown in the continuity of the self, and that this breakdown led to a fragmentation of the personality. This fragmentation resulted in a split between the patient and the outside world. The Divided Self is a challenging but rewarding read that will give you a deeper understanding of Lange's work. It's a book that stayed with me long after I finished reading it. Another great book by Lange is his 1971 work named after the Revolution. He and Delos Smith explored the implications of Lange's work for society as a whole. They argue that our social institutions, including our mental health system, are failing those who need help the most. Lange and Smith's call for a revolution in the way we think about mental illness and for a more humane and compassionate approach to treatment. After the Revolution is a powerful indictment of the failings of our current mental health system and a call to action for those who want to create positive change. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed learning about R D Lange and his contributions to the field of psychiatry. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos on the history of psychology. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Edited by Dr. Stephen F. Myler, Ph.D.